So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Richard. I'm the boss at Cimigo, which is the market research agency that's organising today's event. Luckily, so that's me, looking good, right? Luckily, I'm not doing most of the work today. We have a guest speaker who I will introduce very shortly, who's going to help do most of the work today. But just to let you know what's happening, we're starting now. There'll be a break in about an hour for you can mix and mingle. You've probably got friends here, you've probably got competitors here, and you can have a chance to ask questions from anybody you'd like to talk to. And then we will recontinue at 10:30, and we'll be applying some of the theory that the professor today will be sharing with you to how that might be applied in your daily lives in marketing. Okay. So, this is a quote from John List. Taking a course in behavioural economics, and a lot of what we're talking about today is behavioural economics, and Graeme will explain really what that means to you, is a little like going to dinner at a cannibal's house. A cannibal is somebody who eats another human. And what it's suggesting is that because you're in a behavioural economics seminar, you are going to be part of the experiment. Hence, you will need to take part in the experiment that will be coming forth. So you might be enjoying the dinner, or you might be the dinner, as it were. Am I? And who? Okay, so the first experiment, if you've logged into Menti, is this. So you guys on this side of the room, if you could put in the code 865383, and for everybody on this side of the room, it would be wonderful if that screen worked. Perfect. Then you could put in the code 57437. Okay? And then just answer the question. Simple as that. If anybody needs help, just ask. Go back to the... Sure. So the password for the Wi-Fi is Dream195, and then the website is menti.com. Luca? I can't tell whether you're reading Facebook or actually doing the experiment. Okay? The silence is deafening. Is anyone stuck? Oh, no. Okay, so I will. I'd like to introduce Graeme to the stage. So Graeme is a professor in economics at the Fullbright University in District 7, and whilst Graeme teaches economics, he teaches a number of subjects, but he has a passion in this subject, which is behavioural economics, and is a very knowledgeable man on the subject matter, and far more intelligent than I will ever be, so we're privileged to have you, Graeme. Thank you for joining us. And Zhang, would we be ready to show some results yet? Yeah. So Zhang's going to show us, I hope, if this works, a couple of results on how much value you put on that orange juice when you're on the beach. Normally the question is asked of beer, but as there's a lot of ladies in the house, we switch to orange juice.
Well, good morning, everyone. Happy to see everyone here. Hope you guys are excited to be here as well. My goal for today is that maybe there's a few things, a few ideas that come across in my talk that are relevant to your business, to how you're thinking about your customers, and ultimately to have a better understanding of perhaps the Vietnamese consumer. Okay. So right now you've all just participated in your first audience experiment, and it was asking you the following question, or putting you in the following situation. Imagine you find yourself on the beach, it's been a hot day, you've been drinking icy water all day. You've been thinking how much you would enjoy a nice cold bottle of orange juice, perhaps beer. A person who you're with offers to you that they'll go and get you this bottle of orange juice, and they ask you, how much are you willing to pay? What is the most that you're willing to pay? And as long as the price is less than that, I'll buy it for you. Now everybody received that sort of story with a very subtle difference. One group here was told that their companion was going to get this bottle of orange juice from a little corner store, a little family-type grocery store on the side of the road. And the other group here was told that they were going to that their companion was going to some fancy resort nearby, and that's where the orange juice was going to sit. Okay. And so, our results here are showing that one group tended to favor paying a much higher price than the other. And I'll give a little bit of context to that in a few moments. If maybe we can switch to my slides now, we can start to understand a little bit of what you guys have done here and why this question, why this experiment might be interesting to us. Okay. So, how much would you pay for a glass of orange juice, or a bottle of orange juice, if it was bought from a corner store, or if it was bought from a fancy resort? And so with all the respondents that we had through our survey with Cimigo, we had a similar pattern that we saw with you guys. Those who were told that this bottle of orange juice was going to be bought from a corner store were willing to pay substantially less than those who were told that it was going to be bought at a resort. And so none of this should really shock us, right? We all understand that at a resort we pay a premium, and at a corner store we expect a much lower price. So why then is this an interesting question? So let me bring us back now to the original experiment, which was just like yours, except we're talking about beer rather than orange juice. This was an experiment conducted by Richard Thaler. Richard Thaler is also a behavioral economist. He's someone who won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for his work in this field. And although this isn't his most famous experiment, it's one that highlights something very, very important about how we as people make decisions. And his results hold the same. And so again, I ask, why do we think of this as being an interesting question, an interesting problem to focus in on? And the reason is the following. The question you were asked was not how much would you pay to get a bottle of orange juice or a bottle of beer from a resort or a corner store. The question you were asked is, how much do you value drinking your orange juice or beer on the beach? You're sitting on the beach right now. You're not the person who's going to the resort or the corner store. So it's not as though going to the resort you might perhaps gain some extra benefit from being in a lovely place or being in a nice surrounding. It's not as though you're going to experience a negative feeling of having to go out on the street and weave through traffic to get to a corner store place. The question that we were all asked is, how much do we value this glass of orange juice, this bottle of beer? And so the takeaway from this little experiment is that often the question that's presented to us is not the question that we actually hear. That the question that we hear is something very different from what is really going on in reality. And so while it was all clear, it should have all been clear to everyone here that what you were supposed to be evaluating is how much you would value enjoying a cold beverage of sorts on the beach, everyone seemed to tune in or anchor in on where this is going to be purchased from. And I want to take this as a jumping off point to get into my talk today. So our talk is going to be, in this first section, it's going to be looking at what behavioral economics is. I kind of want to start with a bit of a historical take to bring you guys into how behavioral economics differs from what we might call neoclassical economics or just economics in general. And then I want to sort of show what some of these findings or what some of these understandings of how people make decisions might relate to consumer behavior. Okay? In the second part of my talk, it's going to be much more active. The second part of the talk is going to have a number of experiments that we're going to have you all involved with. So please bear with me while I try to set the stage for the second part. So although the term behavioral economics seems to be somewhat new, I'm going to argue that in fact it's an idea that's been around as long as economics itself. The handsome gentleman that we have in this photo here is someone known as the father of economics, but he's also the father of behavioral economics. And so while Adam Smith was really famous for describing how markets work and how people interact in markets, and the fact that we don't really need a lot of regulation over this, hence his quote that says, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest." And so what this points at is a really interesting phenomenon of how we organize ourselves in markets. The fact that we don't all know our butchers, bakers, and brewers. They don't all know who we are, but the mere fact that they exist and that we have these desires for their goods, markets do run, and they do run to a certain degree in an efficient manner. And so this has been much of what people think of when the name Adam Smith is brought up. What a lot of people know much less about Adam Smith is that he was really much more in tune with human decision making than a lot of economic theory has been since then. So Adam Smith used to talk about both an impartial specter and something that he called passions. The impartial specter sort of represents our rational side, this calculating side, this analytical side of how we make decisions, of how we think things through. For example, if we find ourselves going to the grocery store, we may be shopping for dinner. We may decide that tonight is the night that I'm going to have fish. I go to the area that has fish, and I start looking at which fish is freshest, what the prices are of the fish, the different types of fish, and I decide which is going to be the best bang for my buck. And that's the fish that I end up buying. Now, that doesn't seem like an entirely unreasonable way to start describing how people make decisions, in particularly when we go shopping. But he was also quick to point out that passions, or what we can think of as our emotional side, also play a big role when it comes down to our decision making. And so you can imagine going to the grocery store perhaps a little bit hungry, and although you intend on buying something healthy like fish or vegetables, something cues in on your eye, something catches it, something makes you think that maybe fish is not what I want tonight, and then you go off and you buy that frozen pizza. And so the point here is that a long, long time ago, when we first started thinking about how we could articulate society and people interacting in it, some of the very first thoughts on this were pointing out that while we do have this very calculating side of ourselves, we are also sort of at the beg of our emotional side, and that this is something that can sometimes take over in our decision making. So it took more than 100 years for people to really start to come to terms with some of the writings of Adam Smith, but with that came a really new wave in economic thinking. This is something referred to as classical economics, or neoclassical economics. The man that we see in the photo here is a man named Paul Samuelson, another Nobel laureate. Paul Samuelson and his colleagues are accredited with really formalizing economic thought. They took the ideas of Adam Smith, and in particularly, they took his idea of the impartial spectrum very seriously and started to map out what an economy, what markets look like with math. Okay? They presented people as decision makers, people who had preferences, people who had to make decisions under constraints. We only have so much money, prices are at given levels, and this is ultimately what's going to be driving how we determine what we're going to take. Okay? So, one thing to bear in mind here is that this is a very sort of big departure from how we started to think about economics. Adam Smith was writing long, long essays that were describing the world, and here these researchers came out and started to formalize the world in math. And how they formalized the world ended up making all of our decisions sort of look like this. On the far side here we have a graph. This graph has 3 dimensions, has a certain shape to it. At the top of it, we have an optimum. And so when we say that people are optimizers, or people are trying to maximize what they're doing, what they are in fact doing, according to an economist, or at least our models, is we're searching for that top part of this curve. What we see on the right, on the blackboard here, is how we describe it, how we go from one part of the curve to end up finding this top part of the curve, to try to find where this change hits its maximum. And I want to ask you if this sort of resonates with your thinking when it comes down to deciding whether you're going to buy a coffee, whether you're going to buy fish, whether you're going to buy pizza. How about, does this describe how you would choose a romantic partner, or whether you would decide to commit a crime? Now, those last two might seem like sort of far-fetched ideas, but it wasn't to this group of researchers. So the University of Chicago, for the longest time, has had one of the strongest economic departments on the planet. They boasted the largest number of Nobel laureates for a long number of time. The man that you see here with his Nobel Prize is a man named Gary Becker. And Gary Becker and his colleagues at Chicago did something really quite interesting. They took rational choice theory, as articulated by Paul Samuelson, and expanded it in ways that we hadn't really thought of. Gary, in particular, hit on various aspects of sociology, or regular life, and started to articulate through mathematical representation what the decision process might be in what's going on here. And now, while it might seem a little bit far-fetched to imagine describing with math the decision to commit a crime, I actually find myself following this quite regularly. Well, I don't think about killing people or stealing all that often. We do find ourselves in different situations on on a daily basis where we do sort of conform to how Gary thought of modeling crime. His basic idea is that there's a benefit to committing some crime, and there's a cost to committing some crime. The cost is generally the chance that you get caught and the punishment that comes along with it. And so the daily moment that I find myself in, where I might be committing a crime, comes down to my driving to work. So I live in District 2, I work in District 7, and I drive my motorbike there every day. I go there over the Fumi Bridge. And for those of you who know the road leading up to the Fumi Bridge, there's a narrow little bike lane, and right next to it are two large car lanes, and there's no divider there. And I'm usually going in the morning when it's quite busy, so there's a lot of people driving. Some people are driving fast, and some people are driving slow. And everyone wants to go at their own pace, and so if the people in front of you are driving a little bit too slow, it's likely that you're going to veer into the car lane so that you can pass them. But everyone knows that you shouldn't be doing that, right? So every morning that I go, I can sort of tell what's going on in the road based on whether people are driving in the bike lane or if they've veered off into the car lane. And usually once I drive far enough and I can see that everyone's in the bike lane, it's because the police are on the other side of the bridge waiting for people who are in the car lane. And this is exactly what Gary Becker was talking about. He said that people evaluate the likelihood that they're going to get in trouble for committing any sort of crime, not just the most violent and heinous crimes, but any sort of crime. He also commented, though, that it might be possible to model romantic relationships with math. He thought that maybe rational choice theory had a lot to say about how we choose our lovers in life. And while that might seem like a really, really far-fetched idea, if we look at where we are today, many of his predictions have held true. So he described what he called a market for marriage. And we see that now. We see it everywhere. You guys might call it Tinder or Grindr or whatever the next great dating app is, but this is exactly what he was talking about. It's a matching market where people could go and meet other people. Now, similar to work from Paul Samuelson, Gary Becker and his ilk have mathematical models and representations of everything. And so in his eyes, when he's choosing a lover, he's not seeing somebody that he's attracted to for various reasons. He's seeing an optimization problem. He's asking, how is that person going to view this other person? They're going to look at them, they're going to discount their present value of their net worth, and based on that, decide whether they're going to marry them. Is that how anyone here made the decision to be with their romantic partners? Sadly, it might seem like it's true for me. I'm married to a lovely woman, but she's also a very successful lawyer and has a very flourishing career. But what caught my eye was not her potential in the labor market, but how we happen to get along quite well. Now, one of the interesting predictions that comes out of Gary Becker's Market for Marriage is not so much how you're going to get married, but who you're going to get married to and what those implications are in society. So one of the big takeaways from this model is that it's going to be more likely that people end up partnering up or matching up with people from their own, we'll call it class. And class could be defined as your wealth, as your level of education, as your race, as your location, where you live. But he said that there are going to be some things that are going to drive the likelihood that people get married. Now, what the interesting thing about this is not so much that we end up marrying people that are more similar to ourselves, but what the impact is on society. And what one of the predictions that came out of that model is that this is something that would actually increase inequality within society. As the rich partnered up with the rich and the poor partnered up with the poor, more and more often, there was going to be less of an even distribution of income and more of an uneven model. But while the guys at Chicago were dreaming up all different ways that they could apply rational choice theory to different aspects of society, there were a number of other researchers in economics that were a little bit skeptical about this approach. A number of them realized that this impartial specter that Adam Smith described really only represented a small part of our decision making. And what started off as a couple paradoxes to rational choice theory, coming from a man named David Ellsberg and another man named Maurice Allais, really led into what we now see and know as behavioral economics today. So Ellsberg and Allais came up with experiments and examples where people deviated away from what rational choice theory would predict, and in doing so sort of suggested that this theory seems to be a little bit incomplete if it cannot predict what's going on in these somewhat simple environments. The man in this picture here is named Daniel Kahneman. Daniel Kahneman also won the Nobel Prize in economics. He's a behavioral economist, along with his PhD supervisor, Amos Tversky, were really some of the first researchers to start pushing back at all the rational choice models that were coming out of the University of Chicago. And what these researchers started to do is show systematic breakdowns in rational choice. So not just a one-off instance where people were deviating from this behavior, but they were showing now systematic breakdowns of how people were making decisions. This is a huge sort of push in economics in general, because what it started to say is that not only are these theories not predicting everything, but they're missing out on things in ways that we can actually predict. And so there must be something that can be done with these models to make them a little bit more understandable. So that brings us to today's talk. Today's talk was inspired by this book by Daniel Kahneman, which in essence sums up his entire life's work. One thing that some people aren't aware of Daniel Kahneman is that he was actually trained as a psychologist, so he's not an economist. He just found himself interested with the current direction that economic thinking and academics were going, and got himself involved in trying to understand a little bit more. As a psychologist, he was aware that some of these ideas that we had coming out of rational choice theory were not very accurate at all, and spent his life's time coming up with various studies and experiments that showed how people deviated away from this. Now, while this book discusses many of his individual contributions, there is a big sort of message that comes out of his research. And his big message is actually no different from what Adam Smith had articulated 150 years earlier. And that is that we are somewhat of people of two minds, this impartial specter and these passions. Unfortunately, Daniel Kahneman wasn't quite as poetic as Adam Smith, and so he just referred to these two modes of thinking as system 1 and system 2. System 1 is very much like our passions. It's our emotions, it's our impulse, it's our intuition. It's driving our decision making. Things that just sort of happen. System 2, on the other hand, is like our impartial specter. Someone who is very calculating, analytical, intentional with what they do. In fact, they are actually doing something when using System 2. Now, perhaps the sad part of this story that Daniel Kahneman tells is that while we do have an emotional side and a rational side, our emotional side tends to be outcompeting our rational side in many, many instances. In fact, today I'll show you a number of examples where we are going to find ourselves, even when we're being primed to actually think hard about a question, to be fooled into just reacting sort of reflexively. So with this in mind, I want to kind of try to drive home this idea a little bit harder about what we mean by System 1 and System 2, and I want to do that by showing you a few images. Okay? And when I show you these images, I just want you to look at them and think about what you see. So here's our first one. Here's our second image. So, what did you think of when you looked at the gentleman on my right or your left? Maybe you saw a happy man, maybe you saw someone that looked like a relative or someone from your neighborhood that you know. Maybe it looks like he's just going to sit down and have some lunch. Now, how about the image on the right? What's the answer there? 17? Yes. So while I asked you, what did you think when you looked at these images? Really the question I meant to ask you is, how did you think? With the first one, there was no provocation of anything. You were shown an image of a man who seems to be a happy man, and different thoughts came to you. When I showed you this little mathematical problem, something very different went on in our heads. We had to start accessing programs in our minds that sort of told us how to add up numbers, which numbers to add and subtract first, what the order of operations are. And so the idea here is that with the image of the man on the left, this was something that just happened without any sort of effort. But the image on our right, we actually had to be very intentional with what we were doing. And so this is, in essence, how we can think of or sort of sum up the differences between System 1 thinking and System 2 thinking. System 1 is very fast, very very effortless, very intuitive, very emotional. System 2, on the other hand, is slow, it's intentional, it requires effort. We need to be conscious about this, and it's a methodical way of thinking. And so with that, I now want to show you a short little video. In this video, you're going to see 8 people, 4 of them dressed in white, 4 of them dressed in black. The white team has a basketball, the black team has a basketball. And what I would like you to do, and this video will take about 20 seconds, is just to count the number of times the white team passes the basketball. All right, so how many did you count? I think 13's about right. How many here saw a moonwalking bear in this video? Take a closer look. And there we've got someone dressed like a bear dancing. So, what's the point of this video? The point is, you were being asked to do something that requires system 2 thinking, to analyze a screen, to count. This is not very challenging thinking, but it does require a little bit of focus. And the point is that we were so focused in on this little task that we aren't even able to see what's going on in the actual environment. And I want this to sort of be a point for us to think about in moving forward when we start looking at how consumers start to behave and how, despite our best intentions of trying to use our system 2 way of thinking when we're making purchases, that invariably this is not always going to work out that well for us. So, what I want to do now is I want to start putting in a little bit of application to this idea that we might be a person of 2 minds. I want us to start thinking about what it's like to go shopping. I want us to start thinking about what is going on in our mind when we're making decisions over what we're going to buy. And to do this, I want to start with a couple of little stories that are really going to sort of highlight how deeply ingrained System 1 thinking is. This first story that I want to tell you looks at how we sometimes make impulse buys and the role that advertising might play in. Now, before we hop right into this story, I want us to do the following thought experiment. Okay? So you won't need your mobile phones for this. I just want you to imagine you're in the following situation. You've just finished a very stressful stretch at work, you're quite exhausted, and you're really in need of a vacation. You booked yourself into your favorite resort. You arrive, you check in, you go to your room and unload, there's a knock on the door. A person's there and says, if you would like, right now, we're offering a free 15-minute massage. Or you can wait 20 minutes and have a free 20-minute massage. What would you like? So with a quick show of hands, who in the audience thinks that they might veer towards the 15-minute massage? A few people here. How about the 20-minute massage? Okay, so somewhat of a 50-50 split. Now I want you to consider a slightly different situation. Again, you're exhausted from work, you're looking forward to a vacation, you booked yourself into your favorite resort. A week in advance, you get a call from the resort. The person on the other end presents you with the following options. They say, would you like a free 15-minute massage in 160 hours, or a free 20-minute massage in 161 hours? Who here would choose the 15-minute massage? Who here would choose the 20-minute massage? Okay. So this little thought experiment is meant to highlight an important and troubling bias that we all suffer from in varying degrees, and that's one of what has been called time inconsistency. And what it means is that essentially we end up placing so much weight, so much value over the present, over right now, over this moment, compared to the future, that it results in a wide range of behaviors that we know are not necessarily good for us. Okay? So some of the self-control problems that have been shown to be caused by time inconsistency come down to things like drug use, smoking, eating too much, exercising too little, saving too little. Now, while all of these self-control problems seem to be quite different, they all boil down to the same principle. And the principle is the following. Each one of these problems comes with a benefit and a cost. If we consider smoking, someone who smokes, the idea of having a cigarette right now or in the near future is a benefit to them. It relieves stress, it perhaps allows them to focus more, it gives them the break that they're looking for. This is definitely something that gives them some sort of positive experience. Quitting, on the other hand, is hard. Has anyone here quit smoking before or tried to quit smoking before? It's not a walk in the park, is it? Right? And so here's where the timing of events sort of becomes troubling, especially when we place too much weight on how we're feeling right now versus how we might feel in the future. And that is, this pleasure that we derive from smoking the cigarette right now is just so much greater, or we feel that it's so much greater than the health problems that we're going to have in the future, that we continue to smoke, that the benefit from smoking to us today seems to greatly outweigh the cost of being unhealthy in the future. The same is true with overeating, or my favorite, the lack of exercise. It's always easy to say, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to exercise. When I wake up in the morning, I'm going to go for a run. But then we wake up tomorrow and we say, you know what, tomorrow I'm going to exercise. Tomorrow is the day that I'm going to go for a run. And this keeps on going and keeps on going. So how we think about time actually plays a really big role in a lot of the decisions that we make. And unfortunately, a lot of these decisions end up not being the greatest ones for us. This is a favorite photo of mine that really just drives home how deeply ingrained this time inconsistent problem is that we have. So we see a gym here, and we see an escalator leading up to the gym. We see two gentlemen on it, dressed as though they're going to the gym. And yet, while they have the option to walk up the stairs, which might be a good way to start to warm up, they're putting off exercise until the very, very last minute. So this is not just, I'm going to go running tomorrow. It's going to be, I'm going to go running in 5 steps. And they're just not willing to take those 5 steps to start their exercise. So, how does this sort of bias, this problem that we're inherently ingrained with, affect us when it comes down to consumption? So for that, what I want to do is think about what goes on when we're hungry and the different ways that we make decisions while we're hungry. Studies have shown that when going to a restaurant on an empty stomach, we end up ordering too much food. When we go to a grocery store and we're hungry, we end up buying too much food. A really sort of interesting study that honed in on this took place at an office. What happened was one week, a lady came by and visited everybody in the office at their desk cubicles and offices and said, in 1 week's time, I'm going to bring you a snack. You're going to have a choice between an apple, an orange, a chocolate bar, or some candy. A menu like that, some healthy items and some unhealthy items. Now what went on in this experiment is they asked some people right before lunch what they would like and some people right after lunch what they would like. And those before lunch invariably chose the unhealthy snack much more, and those after lunch invariably chose the healthy snack much more. Now what was really interesting about this experiment is that a week later, when it was time to deliver these snacks, the experimenter lied and said that they had lost this paper and didn't know what you had chose the week before. And so then allowed you to sort of reconsider maybe what you had done. And visited a slightly different group of people before lunch and after lunch. And again, found the same sort of decision bias. Okay? So what this points out is that certain states that we confine ourselves in, certain senses that are activated, can really sort of exacerbate the problems that come along with time inconsistency. And so the question then becomes, how can we start to measure this in a little bit more systematic way to understand really what might be happening? And so for this, I want to tell you about a quick study involving children. So what happened with these children is they were brought into a room, perhaps not unlike this room here, and they were offered a small glass of juice right now, or they could wait 30 minutes and they could have a big glass of juice. And in such a situation, children are remarkably patient. 75% of them were willing to wait the extra time to get a larger glass of juice. Except with this other group of students, or of children. And what happened with this group of children is that while they were offered a small glass now or a large glass later, while they were being offered, they were actually shown this glass of juice. And just being in the presence of this glass of juice was enough to really flip the decision-making in entirely the other way. So now we saw nearly 3/4 of the students children opting for the glass of juice now, and very few of them being willing to wait later. So this study starts to point in the direction of what might be triggering this time inconsistent preference, this lack of self-control that we might have. And the direction it's pointing comes down to our senses. What we see, what we feel, what we touch, what we hear. And so on that note, I want to bring these different studies together and ask ourselves something related to advertising. So it's not been all that uncommon to try to catch the eye of consumers with different sorts of imagery. The type of imagery I'm going to be talking about in this study refers to more sexual imagery. So there have been a number of studies that have looked at the role that sexual imagery plays in particularly male consumption behavior. It's been shown that showing men an image such as this relates to higher brand recall, remembering what they'd like or what they'd seen. They tend to evaluate the product or service much higher. They're actually able to keep their attention on what's being sold to them a lot better. And it increases the likelihood that they're going to make a purchase. But the study that we're going to look at now is going to ask if we can actually start to measure and understand a little bit deeper how this imagery might be resulting in these things. Is something like a lady in a bikini forcing or causing people to act with less self-control? So here's how they decided to set up this experiment. They had two groups of men. There were women part of this experiment. I think from previous experiments they realized that women were slightly more sophisticated consumers than men. But anyways, in this experiment, groups of men were shown 15 sets of images. One group was shown landscape images, like the ones on the right here. Others were shown more of what we'll call a sexy woman type image, women in lingerie or swimsuits. Okay. So both groups of men were shown one set of these photos, 15 of these photos, and then asked about how they felt between accepting $15 today or how much they would need to be compensated for to wait 1 week or 1 month. Okay? So similar to the children in being asked to delay their consumption or their benefit, they're trying to understand how this is going to be affected through this type of imagery. Okay? And so here's the result. And while the result may not come across quite as clear from the graph, what we're seeing is something to the following effect of how being exposed to such imagery affects how men will discount future rates. What we can see is that if you were to offer someone $15 in a week's time, if they were exposed to the sexual imagery, that they would actually need to be compensated a whole lot more. Sorry about that. We in fact see a difference of nearly twofold change by being exposed to this type of imagery. And now what that tells us is that in such an instance, when you are sort of exposed to what we could call a hot stimuli, these images, that men are going to be nearly twice as likely to make some sort of impulse buy out of it. So let's bring all this together here. So this first story tells us a few things. It says people do have self-control problems, and that these problems are real. It says that these problems are even worsened when we're in the presence of what we could call hot stimuli, or the example of sexual imagery. And that in this instance, men in this presence of such an image are much, much more likely to make impulse buys. And so I want to bring this back to our idea of system 1 and system 2 thinking. And this is exactly what we're sort of getting down to, is that despite the fact that both groups of men are being asked to do the exact same thing, by being exposed to slightly different stimuli, we're seeing very, very different reactions as far as what they're going to do and how they're going to behave. But there's something a little unsettling about a story like that, a study like that. And what's unsettling about it is that it doesn't take place outside where you and I live. It took place in a lab. A lab is a very artificial setting. A lab is not the real world. So, two of my favorite economists who are both out of the University of Chicago, Stephen Levitt, he's the author of Freakonomics, which I think is somewhat well known, and John List, who had an earlier quote that we had read on, published a paper that was sort of calling those in behavioral economics out and saying, well, all this that's going on in the lab is certainly cute. Does this really matter in the real world? So they asked, perhaps the most fundamental question in behavioral economics is whether findings from the lab are likely to provide reliable inferences outside the laboratory. Because the lab systematically differs from most natural occurring environments, experiments may not always be readily generalized. So to answer that, I want to tell you yet another story. This story takes place in the US secondhand auto market. The secondhand car market in the United States is somewhat of an interesting one. While there are dealerships that you and I would go to buy cars, the original selling and purchasing of these cars that you see at these dealerships take place at these large auctions. At these large auctions, the buyers and sellers that are there are both dealership representatives. So these we can consider as actually professional buyers and sellers of cars. These are not people like you or I who may only buy one, two, or no cars in their entire life. These are people that are buying tens of hundreds of cars a day. Okay. And so the story is going to look at the sale of these cars in these auctions, and it's going to hone in on the odometer reading of the cars. So the odometer is this little scale on the left-hand side there that measures how far the car has been driven, kind of a gauge for how much use it has come out of. But before we hop into this story, I want to show you yet another thing that seems to be somewhat common in the marketplace that we see. So right here, we have a number of advertisements of homes, of apartments being sold in District 2. And what's the one thing that we sort of see that's somewhat in common with all these different advertisements? Well, it's how the prices are set. We have apartments being sold for $8.9 billion, not $9 billion. $3.9 billion, not $4 billion. $4.9 billion, not $5 billion. And this is something common. We see it everywhere, not just on the price of apartments, but on the price of food, on the price of clothing. It's not uncommon to see prices sort of gauged this way. A number of studies have looked into this. The bias resulting from this has been referred to as left digit bias. And what left digit bias sort of highlights is that somehow the difference between 8.8 billion and 8.9 billion is significantly smaller than 8.9 billion and 9 billion. Somehow switching over or up to that next digit really plays a big psychological factor in how we're going to do a price and the likelihood that we're going to get a sale. So now I want to get us back in thinking about cars, secondhand cars, right? And the relationship between the price of a car and how far it's been driven. Okay? So I want you guys to think for a second. On the vertical axis here, the y-axis, we have the price of secondhand cars. You might think that this is these are very low prices. Again, we're in the United States where there's very little, if any, tax on these vehicles. And so we can see secondhand cars selling for under $20,000. On the horizontal or x-axis here, we have the mileage that's on the odometer, going up in increments of 20,000 miles. And so I ask you, what do you think this graph is going to look like? What do you think the relationship is between the price and the amount of usage a car is having? I see some people sort of pointing downwards, that there's going to be sort of an inverse relationship. In other words, the newer the car, the higher the price. That seems to be quite common, right? So everyone maybe has some idea like this. We could even imagine there being a little bit of a curve saying that the price drops sooner or quicker when the car is younger, and then it sort of flattens out. But regardless, this is kind of a relationship. But now I want to ask you, what is this graph going to look like if we assume that our consumers suffer from left digit bias? And in particular, not on the price, but on the mileage read on the odometer. So this is a little bit trickier, right? But if we start to think about it, the idea of left digit bias is that as soon as we go over a certain threshold, there's going to be a more significant change in our behavior. And so when we think about what this graph would look like under left digit bias, what we might imagine seeing are some kind of discrete jumps as we go from a car that has 9,999 miles to 10,000 miles, from 19,000 miles to 20,000 miles, from 29,000 miles to 30,000 miles. Okay. So this is what we think things might look like if people suffer from left digit bias. Now let's take a look at the actual data. So the actual data here looks exactly like our previous graph. Well, maybe not exactly, but it certainly highlights something strange is going on. We're not seeing a smooth decrease in price over time. Instead, we're seeing discrete jumps. These discrete jumps are happening at larger parts every 10,000 miles, but even at every 1,000 miles, there is a discrete sort of change. Okay. And now these changes are not huge, but they do sort of add up in the long run. So your average jump in going from, for example, 29,900 miles to 30,000 is about $300 in the price of a car. So with that in mind, when we start thinking about System 1 and System 2, and we start thinking that the people who are engaged in this market are actually real professionals here. They're not people who are just buying their one and only car for their lifetime, but people who do this for a living. We might predict that they might understand this or be a little bit more aware of what's going on and might have been reacting to it as well. And that's exactly what we see here. So this graph is now looking at something very different. This graph is looking at the number of cars being sold based on the mileage that they have. And what we see, if we look hard enough, is that right before we start getting close to these, the next sort of bin in 10,000 miles, we see increases in the number of cars actually being sold at these prices. So in other words, the sellers of these cars are well aware that these are the ones that are more valued, that they can get a significantly higher price for this car, as opposed to letting the car drive another 10 miles and go over into the next bin. But remember, not only are the sellers professionals here, the buyers are professionals too. And so the buyers are aware of what's going on and are still willing to pay these premiums at this point. And the reason is because when you start looking at the final sales market in secondhand cars, we actually see that people like you and I, when we go to buy cars, this jump is not just $200, but a little bit closer to $1,000. So this has huge, huge ramifications for the sales that they're doing. So, what's the takeaway from this story? The takeaway is that left digit bias is pervasive. It's not just something that affects us when we look at prices, but something that affects us in some ways at deep, sort of subconscious levels. I don't know if anyone really looks at the odometer so specifically that they're looking down to the very mile, but the data from this study really suggests that there is something going on at these increments. The study went on further to look at the car market in Canada to make sure that the mile was not just some weird sort of measurement, and in fact the same thing holds up in Canadian data where we use kilometers rather than miles. And the other thing is that us as consumers need to need to sort of step back and ask ourselves a few questions about what's really going on in our minds when we are making these types of decisions. How are we really thinking through the purchase of big things like a car? We're not just talking now about a glass of orange juice, but we're talking about something a lot more significant. And so on that note, I'd like to wrap up the first part of my talk here by sort of highlighting some of the bigger messages here. Most importantly, that the psychology of people really does matter. It doesn't just matter in the lab, it matters in the real world. We see it showing up in a wide variety of instances. In particular, what we see is that System 1 is showing up without us knowing. Even when we're focusing in on counting the number of passes that the white team makes, we're unable to sort of really absorb the entire environment that we're being exposed to. And while it can show up without us knowing, it also shows up everywhere without us knowing. And so on that note, I think we'll take a break for tea, and then when we come back, it's going to be a much more active session where you guys are going to be participating in a number of experiments.